If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. I wanted to tell you a story from our group class yesterday. This was the second of 8 group meetings, and the purpose of the meetings is to implement attention compass for the folks that are attending. And we're moving along as usual at the normal pace. And the members are beginning to understand where we're on and what we're after. Nick is in the class, and he brought up an interesting question about communication and interruption, and I'll bring it out to the podcast today. Nick's a manager, team lead, and he has an organization. Now, the rest of us in this particular group are entrepreneurs, solopreneurs. We have loose connections, but mostly we work by ourselves. And solo actors have lots of freedom about how they interact with other people. But Nick has these teammates. And I think a lot of you that listen to the podcast are in that kind of an environment, and it's a challenge. Nick feels like he doesn't have a ton of control because it's part of his job to have a leadership role and to manage other folks in the organization. His specific question had to do with, what do you do about interruptions from other people? Open door policy. I'm a manager. My people have questions. What do we do about that? And how do you best deal with it? So that's where we're going to focus today in the podcast. To understand the question, we're going to talk about the mechanisms for communication. We're going to zoom out and get the big picture of what's going on there with communication. We'll talk about how it fits into the rest of our lives. And then we're going to paint a general picture of how to solve the problems with that set of things in our world. Now, when we don't manage this stuff, it gets loose and it consumes way too much of our attention. And those of you that are in leadership or on a management team understand this. And if you let people suck up your time, they will. This is why a lot of managers can't get their own stuff done. They've let the communication really build out into a life of its own. They've created a culture here and set up expectations with people. So we'll talk about how to manage all that, about expectations, about the different ways that these interruptions and communication challenges happen. But again, if we let them get out of hand, then what happens is we feel like we're not doing our job. Well, that is, I'm the manager. I'm doing my job managing, but I'm still not getting to the important stuff. And I would suggest that there's more to your job than just talking to the people on your team and other things that you need to be doing for and with them. And if you're not careful, this might wind up being a pretty serious problem in your work. I think a lot of people get done with the day and they look back on the day and say, well, I didn't do anything. I think if that's true, a lot of it is because this communication has been happening. So how do we deal with it? How do we think about it? How do we control it? And at the end of this episode, you'll have solid strategies for dealing with communication, and it'll be based on how we should deal with information generally. Communication is a subset of information in our lives. Typically, with communication, we're referring to information exchanged with another human being. It's a one or two-way path, but the target of communication is a human person. And it at least, whether it's two-way or one-way, it at least has some qualities of two-way communication. And we'll talk about all this and problem solve in detail against it. Now, the purpose of information in our lives is to understand our environment and figure out how to react to it so that we can meet our goals. And that's what information is for. Now, information is a big, mushy thing. It comes at us through a lot of channels. Of course, eventually that turns into our eyes and our ears primarily, but there's a lot more than that kind of in between. I explained to people the notion of information channels. So information channels are places that we go to elicit information about our environment. The typical information of do it again. A typical example of an information channel is about the world we live in. We turn to other information channels to learn about something we want to learn about. We might attend a lecture, which is tuning in to an information channel. Now, some of these information channels are communication channels, but lots of information channels are not communication channels. And we'll talk about why that is. But we go into an information channel for a purpose, and those purposes can vary. But when we get into it, or when we're going to a channel, we need to be very clear on what our purpose is while we're there. Why am I doing this? Do I have space for this in my world? What's my purpose? Does this fit in with everything else I'm trying to do? And that'll help us manage it and make sure that we have the attention that we need to do all the different things that's going on. So here's the fundamental conflict, and I'll talk about this a good bit. Information consumes our attention. Information is useless until we give it some of our attention, and maybe quite a lot. In fact, that's why we open up an information channel. We have the intent to give information to some information that's important to us, to find out about our environment or some aspect of our lives. I'll give an example. One of the communities that I'm involved in has a Facebook page. And I'm pretty interested in the community and I want to have relationships with those people. But I don't use Facebook. I don't like Facebook. I do not want to have Facebook in my life. But that's an information channel about the community. So I face this challenge, this question, which is, do I engage in this information channel? I got to think about what's the value of the information to me. It's another channel that I would open up and another use of my attention. Can I afford that? It's Facebook. I don't like Facebook. Even with that explanation, the information channel concept is a vague thing. And I said we'd categorize so we can try to understand information channels better. And there's a few categorization schemes, but I want you to notice these are not exclusive to each other. There's some overlap between them, and it's just some ways to think about information channels. So one categorization scheme is active or passive. Now, in many cases, this is in how we decide to set it up. An active channel signals us in specific ways that there's information available. And a passive channel waits for us to engage with it to tell us that there's information available. And a lot of times the difference between an active and a passive channel is, do you have notifications turned on for it? In addition, there are different levels of active. Some channels will send you an email versus other channels will send you a notification or an alert on your mobile to ping or ding at you. So generally, if it has an alarm style signal, then I would call it active. And if it doesn't, then I would call it passive. So if it sends you email, that's probably passive. Versus if it sends you a text message that makes your phone ding, that's probably active. The point is we can control this to some degree. Now, it's interesting because many information channels are moving towards active status. They're trying to have active status in our lives. And this, frankly, is one of the ways our attention's getting sucked away from us. People that are trying to sell us things want to get our attention. And so they're really encouraging the use of active channels. I don't believe that active channels are necessarily any better than passive. I don't think active helps you consume the information better, but it does tickle your brain's sense of urgency. And we'll talk more about that. So one way is active versus passive. And the difference is active has alarm style signals and passive doesn't. And the important takeaway is that we usually can control that. So another categorization scheme is a one-way channel versus a two-way channel. Now, I would say a two-way channel is a communication channel. It involves two human beings more or less directly. I would say a one-way channel is a consumption or a production channel, and it really only involves one human being, at least one at a time. When we think about a consumption channel, we might be talking about a website you go and visit once in a while. You're consuming the information. There's not really another person involved, particularly at that time. A production channel, for example, this podcast is a production channel because there's only one person involved while it's happening, and that's me. Now, at some point, you'll be involved, but then it's a consumption channel for you on your part. So for me, it's a production channel. For you, it's a consumption channel. And this is a contrast to the two-way communication channel style that we use when we're both involved at the same time. So that's the two-way versus one-way. Now, that's closely related to the next categorization scheme, and that's synchronous versus asynchronous. Now, this categorization, in my mind, applies only to two-way channels and only to communication channels, because any one-way channel is automatically asynchronous, if you see what I mean. A synchronous channel for me is pretty easily defined as one where both parties can determine whether they have the other party's attention at any time. And anything where that's not true then is asynchronous. The interesting part of that definition is that asynchronous channels can disguise themselves as synchronous. They can appear to be synchronous. And we get into some trouble in that we believe we can detect whether or not we've got another person's attention when in fact we can't. Since we can't know whether we have the other person's attention, we have to communicate differently on an asynchronous channel. I have to anticipate whatever challenges you may have in understanding the information that I'm putting on the channel. I have to think more carefully and more clearly about what's going on because I can't see you. I can't see you give me a puzzled look. You can't interrupt me while I'm writing an email to you and say, no, wait, Larry, that last sentence didn't make sense. You can't say, hey, why are you banging on about this? I understand it. Move on. Instead, I have to presume what information and what depth is necessary. And our tendency, for many reasons, is to over-communicate on these channels. One of the problems with email and chat is, despite the fact that it's really fast, it's still asynchronous. Speed alone does not make a synchronous channel. It's only synchronous if you can tell whether or not the other person is paying attention. And that's why it's hard to write an email versus having a conversation, because you can't check for understanding. So when we get out into email and chat, we've got to treat it as asynchronous. Now, I did a whole post on this, a whole episode, and I'll link to that in the show notes. So I would say the rule here is, unless you're confident that it's synchronous, treat it as asynchronous, and think about whether or not to move the communication to a synchronous channel. And we'll talk about moving channels later. So one scheme is active versus passive. So that means that we can have some level of control over how active the channel is, because we defined active as alarm style signals. Okay. One way versus two way is another scheme. And we need to be aware of what's going on, because that moves us from consumption or production channels over into communication channels. And when we get to communication channels, and meaning there are two or more people involved, then we got to think about synchronous versus asynchronous. So these are the categorization schemes, and they give us some clues as to what we need to deal with and how we can deal with it. We need to deal with the signal. We need to deal with whether it's a communication channel or some other kind of channel. And if it's a communication channel, we need to deal with synchronous versus asynchronous. So that's a way to outline the problems that we might have here and think about them. We talked about this signaling, this prompting capacity of information channels, and I alluded to the fact that people who provide information to us are doing it so they can acquire our attention. And the best way to acquire our attention is to send us an active alarm style prompt signal versus just sitting there waiting until we turn to you and we instigate the information exchange. So we have to think about that for all of our information channels. Do we want an alarm style signal, or do we want for it to be a passive channel where I have to go and decide to get information off the channel? Now, most people tend to think of signaling, of active signaling, as being convenient to us. But active signal is actually an interruption. For one, you can't know when it's going to go off in a lot of cases. It goes off when there's new information on the channel, and we can't know when there's going to be new information on the channel. But we have to be alert to it at all times, because once the signal is gone, we no longer know that there's information on the channel. And that puts us in this guard post position, this alert position around that channel. And that may not be what we need to do. So that's one thing about this active signal being an interruption. And the other is an active signal. Even if we know when it's going to go off, so we set our own alarm, we can't know what we'll be doing when it happens and whether that interruption will be welcome. So in both these senses, what we're actually doing is we're creating an interruption for ourselves. That might be the right thing to do, but we just have to think about it. As I said, typically we have the capacity to turn highly active channels into less active, if not totally passive channels. And so that gives me the ability to say, among my channels, which ones deserve to be active? Which ones do I need to be active? And one way to control the interruption in our world is by limiting the active information channel. People say, hey, I got a problem with interruptions. And I go, well, they're not all people. Sometimes it's information channels, active information channels, that cause that interruption problem, but we can control it. That said, another problem with information channels is that there's lots of them. There's a ton. And the number is increasing and the amount of information on them is increasing. As I've said many times before, there's enough information out there that you can't keep up. Nobody can keep up. It's being produced faster than it can be consumed. We call that problem information overload. But that just means we have to create good filters for our attention. I did a podcast on that, something about filter failure, and you can find that and do a deep dive on how to create these filters and how to make them active in our lives. Now, another challenge in organizations is they really give us lots of information channels, and they did this. We have to blame ourselves here. They gave us lots of information channels because we told them that we need more information to do our jobs. And they said, okay, well, you can have more information. Well, the problem is more information doesn't lead to better action, better decision making. In fact, it's the opposite. It's been cleanly demonstrated that more information past a certain threshold makes decision making worse. But it's also been shown that when asked, human beings almost always say, yes, I need more information. regardless of the amount of information they're getting, regardless of whether they're consuming it all or not, they always ask for more. So organizations have given us a ton of information. And now that we're aware of the fact that more information is not better, it's always more, but it's not always better, then we can begin to understand that we don't, hopefully, have to consume all the information channels that are present in our world or in our organization. And we can, in fact, be choosy about just consuming the useful stuff. Now, in point of fact, that desire for more information is often just fear-based, and it's double and triple checking to try to avoid doing something that we later, it turns out to obviously have been stupid. And so in some ways, we're engaging in this fear-based information harvesting. But with all those channels, we've got to prioritize them. Because in order for an information channel to be useful to us at all, we have to give it attention. And our attention has limited bandwidth. So in this sense, bandwidth is how quickly we can use our attention to consume information. So maybe it roughly correlates to reading speed or talking speed or listening speed. But that allocation is important because an information channel without attention is useless. That's just the nature of information and how our attention works. And that's why we face this problem. Our attention is our productive asset, but there's also an increasing number of information channels that are trying to consume our attention. I said it before, I'll say it again. We do not have a time problem. We've got the same 168 hours per week that everybody has had throughout human history. It's just that our attention is now our productive asset. So to the degree that we're going to be productive, we need our attention focused on our task. But our attention is also used to process information about our environment. Add to that that our attention is used to entertain and amuse us. And that's where all this conflict is. It's conflict over a scarce resource, and that scarce resource is our attention. And that's why it's important, because if you have information channels that you don't give attention to, they're useless. But we have a lot of them as a safety, and we got to recognize that and deal with it. And we pay attention to a lot of information channels simply because they're there and we feel like we have to. But again, that's the constraint, is our attention. So we got to be very careful and manage that resource very carefully. And part of that management is not to have too many information channels. Again, the providers of information are trying to decide for you. They're trying to make their channels more active. So you got to control it. Don't let your technology be a 6-year-old standing there poking you in the elbow every 30 seconds. You got to prune the information channels. We've got to prioritize them. We've got to turn some that want to be active into more passive. We've got to prioritize things so that our attention budget is put where we want it to be. We got to control it. Technology is great when it's controlled. Uncontrolled technology is always bad. Electricity gets loose, it's a problem. Nuclear power gets loose, it's a problem. Information channels get loose, it's a problem. And so we got to control this thing. Train it. And it's exclusively on us, because our organizations will give us as much information as they ask. And our world will give us as much information as we can possibly consume. I mentioned earlier, this is where we're going to talk about the sphere of concern and the sphere of influence, and that's Stephen Covey. He says the sphere of influence is that part of the world that you have meaning in, that you can do meaningful things in, that you can be an actor in. So we all have a sphere of influence, and we all have a sphere of concern. And the sphere of concern is that set of things that we're interested in our environment, whether we're active about them or not, we're interested. We allow them to consume our attention. And so you can see where this is going. Now, in most cases, our sphere of concern is larger than our sphere of influence. Now, I would think ideally they would be the same size and shape and they would completely overlap each other. But I suppose there's different ways that this gets configured. I think there's, possibly ways that we have influence that we're not aware that we have influence. And so that would be a difference between the sphere of concern and the sphere of influence. But we want to think about the sphere of concern because people are trying to grow our sphere of concern. So people are actively trying to get us concerned about things that we're not currently concerned about. Awareness, new products, advertising, all these different things are intended to expand our sphere of concern. And then we also have this natural curiosity about the world, or at least about certain aspects of it. And that's human nature. I think that's good. That's how we discover things. But that said, that sense of curiosity is getting manipulated in ways that our sphere of concern is growing far outside our sphere of influence. So ideally, that would match up pretty well. And according to Stephen Covey, we should be growing our sphere of influence. And he says that's why the 7 habits are the 7 habits, is because they grow our sphere of influence. But the sphere of concern that's larger than our sphere of influence allows us to be distracted by information that is not actionable for us. And this is often a waste of attention and emotional energy. We've got to be really careful about consuming that information because, again, it utilizes our attention, and our attention is the scarce resource, and that's how we waste attention. Now, we do face a few challenges in our environment here in the culture business environment, and we'll look at those and look at some solutions to them. So the first challenge, and a lot of this is derived from the conversation I was having with Nick about these problems, about his environment. And I just want to say that this is the kind of stuff that we talk about in attention compass training. And this is why I call myself a coach and not a trainer. We talk about this kind of thing as we're learning to implement attention compass, as we're learning to do busy right. We talk about these kinds of issues. Well, where should my attention be and how should I manage these things? We bring real world examples in and we deal with that either in a group setting or in a one-on-one setting. So I just want you to know that's part of what happens when we're coaching. And the reason I do it that way is because we want to build habits. And these challenges are things that can throw us off in our habit building. And if we don't deal with them, I typically refer to them as speed bumps. If we don't deal with them, then we struggle to develop the habits of managing this stuff well. And then we're not winding up doing busy right. So that said, want people to have these good habits. I want you to have these good habits because you're listening to the podcast. The first challenge is the number of channels, but we're going to put this inside an organization in terms of being inside an organization. And the challenge is that we have all these different channels and many of them are different communication channels. So your organization may have multiple kinds of channels that are communication channels. You may have, multiple different Slack kinds of things. You might have Slack and Teams. You definitely have a chat and an email. You got face-to-face. A lot of that works. Maybe you have, other kinds of direct face-to-face communication. And there's a bunch of channels. And part of the challenge here is that we all have a preferred channel that we use. And there's lots that we have to deal with, but we usually have a preferred channel. And if we don't discipline ourselves about these things, then the urgency of the channel is determined by who's putting information on it. And that means that I have to treat all the channels as equally urgent, which means I need to be paying attention to all the channels all the time, whether the information on them is actually urgent or not. To extend the example, my default channel is email. My tendency to send information via email, regardless of its sense of urgency. And I'm getting better at this. I'm training myself at this, but that's my tendency. I had to learn how to not do it. Because if I've got urgent information to communicate, I need to put that on a channel that has some urgency about it. At a minimum, I need to put it on a channel that has an alarm-based notification signal. And you and I, if we're communicating, we have to agree that yes, this channel does have an alarm-based signal. Because if you've got your phone ringer turned off and I think it's on, then I'm going to put urgent information on that communication channel, but you're not going to be able to treat it urgently. So we have to develop culture and standards around this. I'll say there's 4 primary kinds of channels. So kick down my office door, come grab me by my collar. 2 is call me. 3 is text-based chat. And 4 is email. Now, in almost every environment, kick down my office door is the most urgent. Come get me is the most urgent channel. And most of us default to that. So then email, chat, and phone are the ones that cause confusion. And it has to do with this default channel thing. So we need to get with our folks that we communicate with, and we need to agree the order of urgency about these channels. And if we can do that, then that allows us to selectively ignore channels for periods of time and stand guard only on the ones that need standing guard. We agree, hey, if the building's burning down, come kick down my office door. That's never going to happen, hopefully. But then we agree that the phone is the next most urgent. So that next level of urgent communication, hey, the CEO is coming to our factory for a surprise visit. He'll be here in half an hour. That's got some urgency to it. So that's a phone call. And then further out with even less urgent information, but agreeing with that. Okay. Now, the reason that we've got to have agreement is because if we say, hey, the phone is the urgent channel, then I'm going to answer it all the time. I'm going to interrupt what I'm doing to answer it, whether the information is urgent or not. And eventually that's going to decrease the sense of urgency of that channel for the whole group. So if you ring my phone and you want to talk about the ball game, then that's not the right sense of urgency there. So we all need to do this as a group, okay, and make these decisions and hold each other accountable to those decisions so that they become useful in our work. So that's the first challenge. A second challenge is that we need to be really careful to use the proper channel for the proper communication. And this is associated with the story I just told. So a communication can change in its sense of urgency over time. So somebody calls me up and says, hey, I've got this deadline tomorrow and I want to get the stuff to you. And I go, well, wait a minute, tomorrow's not the deadline. The deadline is, day after tomorrow. And they go, oh, well, that's great. Well, so I still have a few questions about that. And so now we're still using an urgent channel for communication that has decreased in urgency. And so what we need to do is we need to think about, okay, let's switch to a different channel so that this information can be dealt with accordingly. Now, there's multiple reasons to use different channels. As we talked about, synchronous versus asynchronous is a big one. But we do need to be sensitive to that, particularly in group conversations and particularly if the level of urgency increases. It's one thing if it decreases, but if the level of urgency increases, then we need to switch channels. That's something that we need to think about, and that's a challenge. And the reason it's a challenge is because our communication tends to be sticky on the channel that it started on. And we tend to not want to change channels within a communication stream. But I think it's important that we be open to doing that and we be sensitive to the need for doing that from time to time. Okay, so that's the second challenge, is this whole business of using the right information channel all the time and being fluid about those information channels. The third challenge we'll deal with here is in organizations and what brought Nick's question to the surface. So he's talking about, he's got these folks that are relatively new to the organization, relatively junior, and they're consistently asking him questions. And he knows that as a good manager, he needs to be responsive to those questions. And he couched it in terms of his organization's open door policy. And that's interesting as well, because every organization at least claims to have an open door policy. But just because they have an open door policy does not mean it's always open. An open door policy means that you can get on my calendar and we can talk about whatever's on your mind. That's what it means. It does not mean that if you want to do it in the next 30 seconds, I'm automatically available. It does not mean my door is, quote, always open, unquote. Sometimes I need to close my door. And that does not mean I'm diverting from the open door policy. It just means that we got to use some scheduled time. But that's sort of a special case. The deal is that this face-to-face thing is an active signaling channel. And it's very difficult to ignore, just like any other active communication channel. The signal is an alert-based signal, an alarm-based signal, and so it's more urgent. When somebody pops up and says, "Hey, you got a minute," that's a little more urgent than somebody saying in an email, "You got a minute." So we need to, based on the logic that we've developed, okay, if it's an active channel, then we need to see about ways to make it a less active channel, a more passive channel. And what's really interesting is that Nick said, "Hey, I got an idea." So he solved his own problem as we were talking about it. And he said, "Well, should I just use office hours like my professors did in college?" Yeah, if you use office hours, then what you're doing is you're making an active face-to-face channel into a somewhat less active face-to-face channel. And y'all all understand office hours. It's, hey, these times on these days, I'm going to be in my office. If you need something, come see me. And we understand that. And what that does is it helps us schedule and prepare for face-to-face communication, even if it's relatively spur of the moment, versus feeling like we automatically have to be available for face-to-face communication. So this is an example of taking a highly active channel in Nick's case and moving it to a somewhat more passive channel. And again, this also exposes one of the other challenges. So when I encourage managers to have office hours, whatever they think they need, an hour per day, couple or 3 days a week, and they set that up, so then people have this opportunity to use this channel, and face-to-face doesn't have to be urgent. It doesn't have to be walking down the hallway right on the way to a meeting or a bathroom or whatever is going on. And so I say, "Hey, try this," and people try it, and they go, "I tried it for 3 weeks and none of my people paid any attention." Well, that's the challenge. That's the challenge. You got to help them learn how to use this and be patient with that. and helping them learn it's mostly conversation. Somebody pops up at your door and knocks, says, "Hey, you got a minute?" And you look at them and you go, "I've got office hours at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Can it wait till then?" And you're beginning to sensitize them to this thing and beginning to hold them accountable to that. And I think over time, people will understand that and use it and make that channel very, very effective. So those are three among maybe many challenges about this information/communication thing that we all have to deal with. It's not easy to deal with. I hope I've made it easier by making it make sense in a information channel context. So I hope it makes a little bit more sense, but it's still going to take effort and consistency to build these new habits. Some recap. So when we think about communication, we think about interruption. And when we think about these things, we need to think about information channels, as we've talked about, and defining this as information channels. And their information channels are very important in our life because information channels are how we understand our environment and gather data to make decisions. So we talked about different ways to categorize information channels. One way to do it is active versus passive, and another way to do it is synchronous versus asynchronous. And those are important to understand about channels, and we have to control them about our channels because in today's technology world, we can usually do that. We can usually make active channels less active, and we can switch between synchronous and asynchronous if we know how to do it. So we can usually fix that, particularly in modern technology. So we can decide, no, I don't want notifications. I want a summary email once a day. And oftentimes we can say when we want the summary email. And then that takes an active channel and makes it less active and less of an interruption. And we talked about the prompting capacity, which is the active versus passive thing. We control it. And we talked about the number of information channels that we feel like we have to deal with, and that number is increasing. And we face that as a challenge, and we feel like we have to try to keep up with all of these different channels, and we've got to be careful trying to do that because we actually cannot. And so we need to be selective, and we need to manage our attention so that we can put some attention on our own productive work, our own value creating work, rather than constantly being forced to contribute it back out to everybody else. We also talked about people who produce information trying to make their channels more active because then it's more likely to get our attention. And we talked about ways to control that. And we talked about the face-to-face, the interruption. We talked about it inside organizations because that's Nick's context. But it's also true outside our organization. So we talked about the sphere of concern and the sphere of influence. And we want to get those things to match up pretty well because it's easy to have this huge sphere of concern and, oh, I'm interested in all these different things. And that might not match up with our sphere of influence. So we wind up spending attention on things that at the end of the day don't matter in our lives. And we need to exert control over that because people who are not in our sphere of concern often want to be in our sphere of concern. And we've got to guard that because we're the only ones that will. So managing that sphere of concern. And we talked about the face-to-face thing. We talked about the open door policy. And that's part of a conversation about what channels we're going to use and how we're going to have in our team or in our organization, we're going to have some culture around this. We're going to have some standard procedure around this. And that way we can be more targeted about channels that we feel like we have to pay attention to at all times. That means we can turn some other things off, at least for a period of time, knowing that they're not urgent. And that allows us to have attentional space to put on the things that we need to be doing in our own world, the things that have value for us in our job description, rather than just communication with other people. So I also talked about this is the kind of conversation that we have when I'm coaching attention compass implementation. So if I was your coach, we'd be having similar conversations to this. So if that's something you want to talk about or hear more about, that's both here at the podcast, and you can hit me up if you've got questions or you think I'm wrong or just want to let me know how you're feeling about the podcast. Hit me at larry@dobusyright.com or connect with me on LinkedIn. I will ask, if you connect with me on LinkedIn, please mention the podcast so that I know you're not some random salesperson, because random salespeople try to open communication channels so they can get my attention. So you see how this all works, and you can imagine that I'm trying to be careful about those sorts of things. Seriously, love to hear from you on this stuff. Just let me know how we're supposed to connect. So information channels, think about it and identify them and use them properly in your world, and it'll help you manage your attention so that you can do busy right. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the attention compass process. Attention compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do busy right.